There y'all go. Okay, welcome everyone. Marissa, would you like to jump in?
Great. Hey, great to have you all with us today. Happy Wednesday. I'm Dr. Marissa Tereski. I use she and they pronouns. Currently actually visiting some in-laws on Pawtucket land, also known as Boston, Massachusetts. So actually, I think, Jessica, let's get started with talking a little bit more about Mockingbird before we then dive into feminist participatory action research, do a little intro, talking about both feminism and research. But I'll let you kick us off with a little bit about Mockingbird first.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so if you don't already know us, Mockingbird does a lot of different kinds of work, but our mission at the end of the day is we want to support, connect, build community with nonprofits to increase the impact of your work in movement spaces and activism, and generally make the world a better place. So we do lots of things under that. One of them that we're going to be talking about today is evaluation and research. And this is one of our um, practices and methodologies that we use. But we also do grant writing work. And through our incubator program, we train brand new nonprofits on the administrative infrastructure of how to run a nonprofit, as well as we do fiscal sponsorship. So I'm so happy to have you all here today. I'm going to be advancing slides for Marissa, but here you go. I'm kicking it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jess. So I'm Marissa Tereski. Got my bio in here if you want to know a little bit more about me. I am really a community organizer turned researcher. I really have all of my research questions grew out of my community organizing and advocacy work, first with food justice movement across New England, and then youth leadership development and progressive movement building across the country, and later as a union organizer as well. And that led me to my graduate studies in urban planning, where I researched a lot on gender disparities and transformational leadership within planning organizations and city organizations generally. And then went on to my PhD, where I started really partnering with a lot of different local organizations in Los Angeles to build their capacity. It's where I found the June Mazer Lesbian Archive, which is where my dissertation work on gender, sexuality, aging, and housing really grew out of. And so just generally, I came to Mockingbird with a focus on research that looks at how identity and emotions in particular shape people's access to places and services across our lifespan. So as the director here at Director of Research and Evaluation at Mockingbird, we really partner with organizations that share our goals, and we do what we can to advance their vision for transformative change. We work locally with more of a global vision. So now I'll jump into talking specifically about feminist participatory action research. Before we get too deep in it, I want to make sure I define my terms up front, just so that we're all on the same page. For some of you, I recognize some of the names of folks in the room. I'm guessing this will be a repeat of things you already know, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So let's define some concepts. All right, Jess, let's head on to the next one. So first, I want to make sure we all know what we're talking about when we mean feminism. So when we talk about feminism here at Mockingbird, we really uplift Black feminist definitions like those of Bell Hooks, of Barbara Smith, who really focus on what we would now think of as more of an intersectional feminism. Or when it comes to evaluation and participatory action research, I like to think of it as a more revolutionary feminist theory. So Bell Hooks says in her book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, she really conceptualizes feminism as the foundation of a future struggle that must be solidly based on a recognition of the need to eradicate the underlying cultural basis and causes of sexism, as well as other forms of group oppressions. Without challenging and changing these philosophical structures, no feminist reforms will have a long-range impact. So, like Kimberly Crenshaw, who folks might recognize more recently, who really popularized the term intersectionality, kind of coined the term intersectionality as well. But other Black feminists had really been developing this concept for a long time and using it as a way to couple kind of action and impact. All right, next slide. So the other definition I want to make sure we talk about is participatory action research. So PAR, as it, well, I'll call it for the rest of this chat, goes by many different names. Some people call it CBPAR, community-based participatory action, participatory research, experiential research, collaborative research, popular education, right? A lot of different names. It often in some communities has actually no name, where people are already doing the work without having read some literature or even taken, classes in it. But what do all of these different concepts have in common is that they're all about partnerships to integrate research with action for social justice and social change. So participatory action research is kind of the fundamental term, and that's rooted in the global South, in movements to resist colonialism, to resist economic exploitation. It's associated with many different people and movements, but it is most often rooted in what Paulo Freire, a Brazilian popular educator, calls the education component of the revolutionary process. So I really like his kind of conception of that. You might have heard of Paulo Freire's famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. People have since, I like this picture, especially because people have since actually reframed it as a pedagogy of hope, kind of hearkening to a nice connection with one of my favorite Mariam Kaba quotes, hope is a discipline. And this kind of his conceptions kind of offer a nice framework for that. So Freire was really doing participatory research aimed at social transformation by building his teaching model around themes in his students' life. So this is really like kind of the fundamental 101 history of participatory action research rooted in this popular education pedagogy. And so teachers in this view kind of become more facilitators. They guide students as they collaborate to find solutions to community problems. It often involved peasants and working class folks creating these popular education circles to really advance their consciousness with research skills. All right, next slide. So research can be kind of a thorny term, I found, depending on who you're talking with. Research certainly has a tough history, has done a lot of harm for sure, but it also can be very confusing. I found that clients who run nonprofits who might not have specifically a research background can be intimidated also by the term research. So I really want to get off the ground what we mean when we use that term here today. So I think about it really as research being a way to identify problems, then analyze the structural roots of those problems. What are kind of the systems and the structures that cement those problems into our existence, and then to collectively identify long-term solutions to those problems. And this approach really provided Freire's largely working class students the organizing knowledge and skills that they needed for self-determination, for the collective action. In the US, a lot of movements have used PAR to challenge dominant systems, civil rights, feminist movement, labor movement. In this photo, We see some SNCC students gathering at the Tennessee Highlander Folk School. They used PAR and popular education as powerful mobilizing tools, which ultimately informed a lot of social movement strategies. And those social movement strategies then in turn actually shaped PAR approaches today. So this leads me to the kind of basic PAR framework that's really more cyclical in nature. Next. Great. So I like this framework. There are a lot of different ways people kind of visualize PAR, but I really like that this kind of it shows that cyclical nature. PAR is really about constantly iterating, right? It's not a linear process. And so again, we have it really being about challenging structures that typically and normatively silence communities. We're identifying problems. What are the questions that you have? What problems do you see in your everyday life? And then we go into the analysis phase, which is about examining what does the other research say about this. This is often done in what academics usually call a literature review, kind of looking at the different data that might help ground what we're seeing, right? Collecting new data as well, or even just through observational field work to see what's happening. Is this just a fluke incidence that I noticed this one time, or is this part of a broader trend that's happening across my entire neighborhood or entire city? And then there's the action piece. So that's really about applying the information to actually do something with the with the analysis that you've done using the evidence that you've gathered. And then finally, reflecting, right? Reflection being that key component. What worked here? What didn't work? What do we know now? What do we still need to know? And then again, iterating kind of consistently. Next. So feminist participatory action research is really building on this PAR methodology to understand complex oppressive structures and really do something about disrupting them. My undergraduate is in anthropology, and I would say that field is so much of ethnography and observational fieldwork is really about looking and listening, but not touching, right? Not actually changing the system. And in PAR, we're really getting our hands dirty, right? We're really looking to change things. Let's see. Make sure. Okay, so let's see. So as Bell Hooks suggests in her definition, feminism really encompasses, oh, actually, hold on a second. Sorry. So we want to really be centering women and gender minoritized people's voices in this research. That means amplifying those historically erased experiences that are really a way of challenging patriarchal oppression. So for instance, hundreds of years ago, there were no public restrooms for women. It was a way of keeping women trapped in their homes, literally out of sight, and using the built environment was a way to do that. And now we're seeing that again today with rolling back of trans people's rights by barring their access to public accommodations. And so really uplifting, right, these experiences, centering these experiences and then grounding it in what we've seen before, that this is kind of a cycle. This isn't just an outlier. And then accounting for this intersectionality is this critical method to honor gender diverse people's voices and experiences, and really etching them into our worldview, writing them into the research process, which can then ultimately shape policies, which shape the way people move through our communities, through our world, through our homes. it also offers these new forms of representation. We'll get a little deeper into who really owns and leads the research with FPAR. But spoiler, it's really the community members. They're what we call co-researchers, co-designing methods, co-designing data collection and the presentation of the data itself. When the community members are kind of guiding this process, the result can be, a revolutionary change that can manifest in such different ways. It might be the social action might be a report, or it might be something like a sidewalk art exhibition, right? It can look in many different forms depending on who is leading and owning the process. Next. Okay, so who is FPAR for? So Bell Hooks suggested in her definition, feminism encompasses so many things beyond research specifically for women. When we research, a lot of urban planners talk about this, when we're researching and organizing for those on the most marginalized, right? And for most marginalized, most forgotten, right? We build spaces for everyone in between to flourish. So by centering those in the margins, we offer more opportunities for justice. I think about this a lot in research on urban planning for women. A classic example is the importance of sidewalks that are wide, right? Really wide and well maintained. And so this can often better enable women who typically bear the brunt of childcare duties. Women can safely hold hands with their children walking side by side, not having to squeeze on a narrow sidewalk. But even for men who have kids, or the women who don't have kids, and folks who use a wheelchair, right? These improved sidewalks can be hugely beneficial to encourage equitable mobility for everyone. So in other words, it's really about centering women's voices and experience in the context of a world that is highly gendered and racialized. The history of feminism also has come in waves, and this current iteration, some people say it's the fourth wave, some people say it's the fifth wave. That is, maybe a conversation for another webinar. But the waves are really important here because they're conceptualized as waves because there's not such clear definition of the phases, right? There's this overlapping and this crashing into each other. And so there is kind of this lack of clarity among the phases. But ultimately, FPAR is really growing as this research practice within movement spaces, movement work to create transformative change. And that change is really guided towards enabling people, particularly gender minoritized leaders in their communities, to flourish in their home spaces. Next. Okay, so you might be, in your home, out and about, waiting for the train, wondering, like this woman is, this all sounds great, Marissa, but how do we actually do it and use it at my nonprofit? So the short answer is evaluations. So program evaluations are going to be a terrific way to embed FPAR into your nonprofit culture and process to really build out that culture of reflection and iteration. Given my role as the director of research and evaluation, I'm particularly interested in how we can apply FPAR to evaluations, which I've seen is probably the most common methodology for nonprofits interested in research. So FPAR principles can be a great complement to feminist evaluations in ways that are intersectional, that are participatory, and that are action focused. An evaluation with FPAR really ensures that that the research is community owned and led through what we call these co-researchers. And they ensure that the value sits with the community, where the evaluator's role is more as a mentor, a supporting role, kind of being invited into the space to provide guidance as opposed to actually leading the process. So this really ensures community leadership, which is especially important amid, the nonprofit industrial complex, that the research is not donor-led or donor-driven, and that the evaluations are actually not simply kind of an accountability exercise, but are really nourishing, useful, fruitful, and owned by those beneficiaries. So co-researchers are people who would be kind of co-owners of over the process, and it's supposed to connote kind of this shared ownership, as opposed to anthropology is kind of the other discipline that I have most knowledge around, and I know they use oftentimes in the word informant, someone who has that community, that cultural knowledge, but it doesn't have much of any ownership over the actual research process. And so co-researcher really is to reflect the continued dismantling of traditional researcher subject power relations there, and also keep the responsibility with the community to take action and be those agents for transformative change. Responsibility is with co-research as a co-researcher, is in every part of the process. So the process and the results should be determined as much as possible by the community by the community that has identified the problems, which ultimately need the exploring through the FPAR approach. So it would be the co-researchers that would co-design the methods, conduct the collection of data, of evidence, of stories. I use the term data extremely broadly, to include data could be in the form of arts, poetry, painting. It could be in the form of stories as an analytical framework. Betsy Sweet has a great article on decolonizing methodologies and talking about the importance of storytelling as a critical analytic tool to decolonize research practices. And then co-researchers would also be leading the analysis of the results, as well as the reporting of findings, and then the developing, implementing, and reflecting on the kind of activist strategies to then challenge those gender injustices that we saw in the first place, which really serve to interrogate those patriarchal roots of the problem from the beginning. So this is all part of kind of ongoing cycles of action and reflection that are inherently collective, which is a key distinguishing feature of FPAR from typical PAR processes, that the reflection piece is really a collective process. We'll get into that in a second. So this is really about evaluating best practices through this kind of iterative, reflective process that isn't linear, right? It's constantly shifting, and about redistributing power, and these intersecting power dynamics that manifest often through kind of this feminist care ethics and kind of collective care ethos. So communities actually really are, let's see, the transformative outcomes really sit with the communities in their own findings and the results. So there's really no question of whether it's even whether results are even shared with communities. As we know, in the nonprofit industrial complex can often happen, that the communities that are identifying the problems aren't even the ones who get to benefit from the work that they might have put into the process. It also ensures really that community leaders' voices are heard and centered throughout the entirety of the research design and process execution, and outcomes as well. And yeah, it provides this possible framework for really evaluating nonlinear change by examining examining those gendered and intersecting power dynamics that shape lived experiences within a given community. All right, next. So what does FPAR add that was missing in other research methods? We've talked a little bit about it, but I just wanted to make sure y'all saw this up front with these kind of five key distinguishing features of FPAR. Krupi and Godin just this year actually did a review of FPAR literature, suggesting especially that collective reflection is a really important distinction, where FPAR is really prioritizing collective reflection to integrate activism throughout the research process. This kind of approach to reflection also allows for some interrogation of those patriarchal roots of how the study is being conducted, the findings themselves, and as well as kind of the role of the co-researchers in surfacing of those findings, as well as any assumptions that are being made along the way, to really uplift those assumptions and just name them and have them be transparent. Also, as a scholar of emotions, I see this kind of collective reflection as this critical method also for navigating loneliness and isolation, right? If we're reflecting together and processing it together, it's also a way of building community. It's also with that distinct role of the co-researcher, it makes it so that the whole process is really community owned and led, in a process that's distinct, I think, from other participatory models of research. It's really about removing barriers to encourage broad participation. The evaluation is fluid. It's got to be adaptive, especially as people are responding to changes during the evaluation process with that consistent reflection. And it's really important that diverse experiences and deep participation are happening, to understand those complex power relations as they affect women, girls, and non-binary people. It's also it's inherently intersectional, as you mentioned, and this I often hear people say, how do we collect data intersectionally? And one way to do this is just start by making sure that the information you are gathering and collecting, that you know who says it, right? Who's saying this? Make sure that it's disaggregated, in other words, by gender. We know some of the other demographic information. If you're not asking in a survey even what folks' gender identities are, what their racial identities are, right? You can't make any of those connections with how your programs and practices are impacting gender and racially diverse people. And then to connect that back to the power imbalances is going to be a critical part of that iterative analysis. And so again, that consistent and iterative action, some people have it just as kind of the final culmination. That's fine if that's what you want. I always like to have it be kind of part of the entire process, as kind of reflective of that cyclical, non-linear aspect of the research itself. So you might voice some ideas for action, let's say, when you're even developing the research questions, and then you have those to really stew on, and continue kind of iterating on as you start collecting the data and see, does this action make sense still? Do we still want to petition this neighborhood? Do we still want to go canvassing in this area? Do we want to put, so you kind of have that action as in the back of your head or in the front, as part of the entire impetus for the research itself. So let's see. And then also, FPAR is intentionally left open. I'm not going to give you a structured toolkit. Urban planners often love toolkits. Okay, what boxes can I check to make sure I've done all the things? But it's really intentionally left open so that you can follow the leads of community members' unique strengths, unique goals, unique contexts that they're in at any given time. All right, next. Okay, so what does FPAR look like as a full process? Oh, shoot, sorry about the alarm going off. Next. So this year, fresh off the press, Krupi and Godin put together this year, 2024, they proposed this framework for guiding principles and practices for how nonprofits and community leaders might undertake a feminist evaluation process using FPAR tools. So there's so much happening here. I know it's a very in-depth overview. But we'll start with the outside areas, those black boxes. Those are really the guiding principles for how to conduct an evaluation using FPAR at each stage. So we've got community, it's going to be community driven, led and owned, as we've talked about. Integrating collective action is another key piece of that, as well as focus on intersectionality and power, up to on the left side, building consciousness, skills and capabilities, and finally, safety and collective care. Then we've got the gray boxes that are a little inside, and those show the different steps for using FPAR, from planning to presentation of data. This is a key difference, again, lifting the social justice action up from typical participatory or general, I'll say, participatory research processes, that the social action, instead of stopping, it's really cyclical. So it doesn't necessarily stop when the evaluation is completed, but stopping actually may occur once the intended change has been realized. And then we've got the inner circle, and those are key areas of change for that the evaluation intends to manifest. And this is adapted, they pulled this from the Asian Pacific Division of Asian Pacific Women's Land and Development Forum. Their theory of change is kind of adapted from this. So starting with capacities, really about capacities it could be in building capacity in documentation, in leadership, analysis, might be in media or advocacy, and then producing new knowledge, tools, and resources. This might be women, authoring their own stories and expertise, might be applying the knowledge, but it's really about amplifying women's voices. Then we've got understanding or undertaking impactful advocacy. It's really about creating advocacy spaces at all scales. Might be advocacy interpersonally, right? Looking at dismantling some internalized trauma just in interpersonal relationships. Could be at the neighborhood level, might be city, regional, state, and so on. And then finally, it's about strengthening movement architecture. So this piece is really about strengthening the institutional movement building as a way of fostering spaces for coalition building, for developing alliances, and ultimately catalyzing and strengthening movements. So next, we'll dive into a little bit more about some of the stages specifically. So first, with planning, as well as the ownership of data. So this is really my bread and butter. This is where participants come to a common understanding of the community itself. What do we even mean by the community? So that definition is really clarified, as well as the main problems that the community is facing. This is also where the purpose of the evaluation is outlined, where the study will be conducted, the roles, the change that they want to make through this whole process. This is also the point at which you develop an understanding of the time and resources that the community has to allocate towards this project. This is also important, an important time to begin building trust among the group. And that's going to be something that happens throughout the entirety of the process and is part of that kind of consistent reflection piece. As part of kind of a safety and collective care, It's also really important when we talk about ownership and ownership of data, to also be thinking of data privacy and anonymity, where it might be possible and where it might not be possible, and just creating kind of those understandings up front. For instance, when I was doing some research with a group of older lesbians in Los Angeles, I did something as concrete as just making sure that the informed consent sheet that every participant had to sign was separate from the project synopsis. And this was really intentional in case a caretaker of one of the participants were to see a signed copy of the consent form. There was nothing on the page that would connect them back to a lesbian oral history project, because I knew that being outed could constitute such a massive threat to these folks' everyday life, with such homophobia in a lot of these home spaces, with caretaker stories of caretakers refusing to give meds or helping to bathe folks once they found out about their queerness. So just knowing about these issues and how it might impact data and ethics around it. So in the case of FPAR, it's really owned by the community. The community is the one who's going to be collecting, analyzing, and owning it, controlling how it's used. The evaluator, if there's an outside evaluator who is a guest of the community, they'll usually offer some sort of initial training on methods and the possibilities for the different methods and some of these best practices for data ethics. And then ultimately it will be the community that would decide on the methods used. There is typically an emphasis in FPAR on more creative and arts-based forms of data collection. So photo, voice, poetry, painting, these kinds of practices. Next. All right, so in interpretation of findings and the presentation of data, this is really where the action orientation manifests. Participants are usually use a discussion-based approach to examine the main issues in their findings. And then once there's consensus on findings and framings, the co-researchers can then decide on the action or change they want to pursue. It's really important, again, to remember here that change is not linear, it's complex. I also think about this as, where there is absence, there's also presence. In other words, capturing those negative impacts, the resistance, and their causes in research is just as important as noting the successes and any positive outcomes, right? This is all enhancing the learning. It's not just for the community, maybe that is owning and leading this process, but it's documentation and important information for other communities as well to learn from these practices, learn about different interventions based on some similar contexts. This is especially important, and a lot of the folks we work with have very cutting edge programming. I know some of the folks here today have some really cutting edge programs, and so having that infrastructure to really collect that data and that information for other communities that might be going through similar processes in the near future is really important. These stages are also where we would get into the radical reporting piece. And so that really emphasizes this collective ownership beyond simply the report itself, but also about the social change. This has to also be community-led, and co-researchers are really the experts in their contextual knowledge, in their communities, might be ancestral knowledge as well that's really necessary and uplifted here. Maybe the reporting would look like a written report, but it might also be a play or a street exhibition. It really depends on what matters most to the community. The Civic Lab for Environmental Action Research, they also offer a lot of transformational feminist and decolonial approaches to publishing. For instance, there are options like a community peer review process, which we're actually looking to adapt for our Mockingbird online journal. Stay tuned for that. Okay, next. And the final piece. Okay, so the social justice action. An evaluator can be especially useful here to provide some activist tools like a theory of change, outlining and training on power mapping to really analyze the context and the plan for actions towards collective goals. So co-researchers and the community would then be the ones to select and plan the actions. Again, the actions can be taken throughout the entire process, not necessarily just at the end here. You might consider, as I said, an action during the planning and then refining it as you learn more during the reflection points. And finally, something that is really a key piece of the social action is the solidarity that comes out of the new learning and information and analysis that comes with FPAR. Solidarity might mean building coalitions with other activists, with other movements and networks to really increase impact. Next. So let's talk about how FPAR has been implemented. I know we're actually running a little short on time, so I'll maybe blast through this a little more quickly. Next. So this case study is from the Asian Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development. They are really the ones who initiated this FPAR approach and really began to conceptualize it. And they did it specifically with their climate justice program from 2017 to 2019. And what they did was they paid young women researchers. They hired them to lead this FPAR program in their home communities. And then the young women researchers would also select a mentor for themselves. This happened across 9 women's rights organizations across Asia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Thailand, and Vietnam, I think were the places. And all the projects were addressing gendered impacts of climate justice through grassroots advocacy in their communities. And so the co-researchers co-designed methods, made decisions about the evaluation process. Now you're probably wondering, what the heck was the process? Next. Okay, so the stages, I do want to mention that the painting on the left is from an artist named Micah Bazant, who is incredible, has a lot of other great art. So these stages are including, but they're not the only things that they did, but these are kind of the main areas of a regional training that was a 5-day training to learn about FPAR, learn about climate justice impacts, globalization, patriarchy. They learned some activist tools like theory of change, power mapping, as well as the data safety and ethics piece. Then they embarked on some pre-research consultations with their communities. This was the point at which they really established research protocols. They were developing the objectives that they wanted to reach, the impact that they wanted to make. And then they began designing the research questions and the way that they were going to then collect the information and the stories. And then they also did some power mapping at this point. This was also in this stage when the young women researchers started forming groups to actually collaborate. So they did that pretty early on. Then number 3, they document the research design. Number 4, the young women researchers started collecting the evaluation data in their home communities. They were implementing the participatory research processes to document women's experiences with climate change. They then wrote a report of their findings and finally came back together with a reflection meeting to collaboratively analyze the data, learning feminist advocacy and planning, as well as campaign strategies. Next. So the methods and findings really supported women to take up action in their home communities. One person reflected that co-researchers and their communities developed new knowledge, skills, and resources to demand climate justice. They then formed new women's groups, networks, and alliances. They were participating in climate decision making, and they actively were leading climate change adaptation activities. So in Cambodia, for instance, the big problem was that women were totally excluded from discussions on a dam that was created and ended up causing severe environmental degradation and forced displacement. Some women refused to leave their ancestral land, which left them totally stranded without roads to connect them to basic facilities. They lacked clean water and safe land to raise animals. So with the young women researchers, the women who relocated and those who remained on their ancestral land documented the negative impacts of the dam. They ended up mobilizing with Indigenous women in other villages to resist future planned dams, and they demanded participation in future decision-making processes within this space. They ultimately successfully lobbied the government, in fact, through these alliances to build roads. They opened a health center and a school. They reinstated teachers and secured access to safe water supply. And actually, since first learning this case, I've heard of so many other cases of destructive dam projects around the world. And so having this kind of information is really can ignite hope and a global movement. So evaluation was really embedded in every step of this process and led to increased confidence and skills in both evaluation, design, and process, also though in their communities at large. Next. So, all right, I just want to name up front that example, that case is huge, right? APWLD's project was big. It took a lot of resources and capacity. I don't want people to get overwhelmed thinking that FPAR has to be this massive undertaking that requires such hugely intensive resources. We've used these methodologies here at Mockingbird, and I really want to uplift kind of the two main pieces to take away to apply whenever you use FPAR, which is the research piece and the action. Often in academia, it's really the research that's the bigger circle and the action kind of fits in little. And then similarly in community space, I find the action is really the big circle and research is kind of a tiny piece of that. But we really like to see them as equally important. And so the research and the action, they're going to look really different depending on your communities, the people's lives and experiences who are involved. But there are always going to be those two key aspects. And the research to us is really about mobilizing those co-researchers with lived experience who then identify and examine the problems in their home communities that ultimately are shaped by those intersectional patriarchal forces. And then when it comes to action, I often think about this as the information that's all in the name of redistributing knowledge, tools, resources that will build capacity that disrupts patriarchy intersectionally. So for us at Mockingbird, we usually start with a small training for co-researchers to learn kind of those basic research 101 possible methodologies that I mentioned, and really get a sense for them really to get a sense collectively of the problems at hand and defining their community. In the case of, with one group that they really wanted to use photo voice. They knew that folks in their communities were really uncomfortable writing and documenting, so something like a daily diary would be of little use there. So co-researchers went out with cameras and recorders to go into their communities and capture the lived experiences and everyday lives of folks. With some research, people experience, some of the cases of research, people experiencing homelessness. We've worked with folks might document the places in their neighborhood that feel safe versus places where they feel afraid. Other contexts with older queer folks, some people just spent an afternoon taking photos of places where they felt powerful versus places they felt lonely. And then these co-researchers would come back together and share those photos with the group. The group then decides, right, what the main themes are, choosing photos that are representative of that lived experience, those lived experiences. And then they choose kind of how they want to report and disseminate these findings, whether it is through an exhibition of these photos or publishing them maybe in a book, using them to maybe mobilize policies towards more equitable community development. In other cases, we've done as a way to secure safer housing. So we really see at Mockingbird this research as a way to learn and grow by facilitating leadership to then build movements, which will ultimately enable people to flourish in their home communities. All right. And I think that I ran a little over. I do want to leave you with just one of my favorite quotes from Leela Watson, an Australian Aboriginal activist, that really is kind of a central piece that I think of whenever doing FPAR and any participatory research. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So I'll end there and leave a few minutes for Q&A. Also, if you want to know more about our work at Mockingbird, here's all of our information. Thanks so much for joining, everyone.
Thank you, Marissa. We've got, I believe, a couple of different questions in the chat. So I'm gonna read it to you. Let's see. I'm scrolling to see where it is. Where it go? Okay. From Elon. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but if I'm not, please correct me in the chat. How do you approach power imbalances between leadership of a nonprofit and other groups who should be centered in the process, like staff, program audiences, or the community a nonprofit seems to serve? In my experience with consultants or professionals that attempt to implement PAR with a nonprofit, is that they are most accountable to the people that they are hired by, often leadership, and aren't really able to challenge power dynamics between different groups in the organization.
Yeah, that can be really, really tricky. And I didn't have time to really get into the limitations. So I'm really glad you brought that up because I think, positionality generally is, is a limitation of any research process, even more so for participatory research, and even more so in the case of feminist participatory action research, where it's really so. I think in the case of inviting in an outside researcher, it's really part of the reflection process, right? That any outside evaluator be really acknowledging their own privileges and balancing the power dynamics, right, that they come with. And trust building is a really, really big part of that. So in any power imbalances, right, doing that work of building relationships and building trust, which I know like is way messier, it's easy for me to say out here, but figuring out processes of building trust, and often in social movement spaces, for instance, that trust building can look a lot like relationship development, and as often happens in like home meetings and one-on-one conversations and these kinds of things, to really build rapport and understand the kind of underlying motivations of people in the work. And that can help to kind of equalize some of the power imbalances. That's also, a big impetus for the co-research model, so that it does try to equal out those power imbalances. But I mean, especially, when you have outside people, and money is a huge factor in that. When you're hiring someone, right? How much are you paying the outside evaluator versus maybe some of the co-researchers who should also, be paid to do a lot of this community work? It can just really reshape things. So I don't think I answered that directly, but in fact offered more maybe complicating factors in that. But yeah, I'm happy to think more and talk more about that maybe offline. But I think, yeah, it's a huge constant struggle. Yeah, in all research.
And I think that's such a great callback to a discussion we had earlier today about maybe we should add in a slide about what are some of the pitfalls of FPAR. And I think that's almost like its own presentation at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We did discuss it though, so very, very pertinent question. AJ, and I think you kind of already answered this, Marissa, but I'll pitch it to you. AJ is asking, can we touch on the financial aspect of this as well, the power imbalance involved? I think you kind of addressed it, but I'll put it out there.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Like the hiring or the redistributing wealth or
Um, uh, AJ, if you want to put it in the chat, there's another comment that says, I have a few PhD students who want to work with me. Would you recommend I share this with them to set the tone or include it as part of the onboarding process? So flattered.
oh, that's a yeah. Um, yeah, you definitely could. Definitely could. I mean, I think a big part, if this is, it depends. Yeah, I mean, this is maybe a cop out, but it really depends on what the goals and the values of your research are, and who it is that you're bringing on, and how well do you know the PhD students? How well do they know the work that you're doing? I mean, I think I know pretty well the work, some of the work that you're doing. We can talk more about that offline, AJ. But certainly, if this resonates with the values and purpose of the work that you're doing in the projects, then certainly I think a lot of the tone can come in, also the relationship building and some of those kind of group dynamics 101 exercises to really build trust and transparency, particularly in communication when you're working in such tough areas of research, as I know, AJ, you are, and it can get very difficult and challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, and I
Trans
think we'd be happy to collaborate with you on putting together like a custom presentation for your work as well, if that's an intro you want to have for the people that you're working with. I think that's very um, astute of you to sort of want to seed that from the very beginning of the relationship. All right, I
Absolutely.
think that's all of our questions, and we're over time, so I think we'll stop here. But thank you so much to everybody who showed up today and participated, and everybody who's watching this after the fact. It's an absolute honor and privilege to get to do this work in community with you all. We're really proud. And this is one of the more controversial presentations we've done the last couple of years. We got a little bit of hate mail about it. Um, I think it was just people being triggered by the word feminist, but I actually think that's kind of great. And I'm so happy to have you all show up here in this space and engage with this really um, amazing deep work that happens with FPAR. So can't wait to hear from you all and chat again soon. So we'll see you later.